What is up, world? My name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking. We are in the advanced learning playlist and I am sweating because the last video was freaking hard. I think it was hard. I don't know if you guys did yet because I haven't seen any comments. I'm just recording this video, but it was crazy. We did a deep dive into how do property wrappers work? Why do they work? Why do we even need them in our application? How can we build our own? But now that we have that knowledge, we can easily take that and work on a bunch of custom implementations for our own custom property wrappers. So this is where it's going to get fun. So now that we have the knowledge, right, we built that base, and now we can really finesse it, right? We're going to make our own, and we're going to make some crazy property wrappers in this video. I would argue probably more complex than any property wrapper you've ever created to date. And again, I only say that because it's the most complex I've ever written as well. So we're going to start with some simple property wrappers. We're going to build some really basic ones like @capitalized or @uppercased. But then we're going to take what we did in the last video. In the last video, we added a property wrapper to write a string to the file manager. We're going to take that and we're going to build on it. So we're going to, instead of writing a string, now we're going to write codable types. So anything that conforms to Codable, we can now save to the file manager with one line of code. After we do that, we're going to build on it. We're going to look at, all right, now that we have this property wrapper working, how do we optimize it for our specific use case? How do we make sure that it is binding? How could we use this with Combine? How could we use this with Async-await? Either I am way overly excited about this and overhyping it, or you're going to agree with me. But either way, I know that we are both on track to becoming expert SwiftUI developers. So at the end of this, you're going to be a master at property wrappers. And that is literally mastering the cornerstone, the fundamental building block of SwiftUI. Hit the subscribe button, hit the alert button, hit the like button, leave a comment. Let's jump into Xcode and write some code. And we are back. What is up, everybody? I am again in the Swiftful Thinking Advanced Learning Bootcamp. In the last video, we learned about property wrappers, and we spent a lot of time figuring out how they work. And in this video, we're going to take what we have learned and just implement a couple different custom property wrappers. Now, I have picked basically 3 property wrappers that we're going to build. They might not be exactly what you need in your app, but I think the code that we're going to use is generic enough that you can apply these concepts to basically any sort of property wrapper that you want to make in your application. So with that said, I highly recommend watching the previous video before this one, because the previous video is where we actually learned what this code is doing. And in this video, we are just implementing. So I'm not going to take the time to explain all of the syntax and everything. I'm just going to write code. So if you leave a comment asking what this keyword means, I'm just going to tell you to watch the last video. That said, let's write some really cool property wrappers. So let's jump in here and let's create a new file for this video. I'm going to right click in the navigator, create a new file, a SwiftUI view, and let's call this one property wrapper 2 bootcamp. Let's click create. So in the last one, we did property wrapper bootcamp, and in this one, we're going to do property wrapper 2 bootcamp. All right. So let's get the preview working here. And again, I'm going to move fast now because we learned already how to use property wrappers in the last video. So if I jump back to the property wrapper bootcamp video, we create @property wrapper. We create a struct. That struct holds some sort of state. And then in order to be a property wrapper, we need to have a wrapped value, and then we optionally can add a projected value. So basically what we're going to do is just speed through all of this basic code and build our own property wrapper. And this first property wrapper we're going to do is basically, if I had an @state private var, let's call it title of type string. I said hello world. Let's imagine every time I set this title, I want it to be capitalized. So for example, let's create a quick VStack here. Let's add a button. The button will just be the title, and the action will just set the title equal to new title. I'm going to make this all lowercase, this string. And what we want the property wrapper to do is basically to automatically capitalize the title on the screen. So if I click this, it updates to new title, but it's not capitalized. So it really should look like .capitalize at the end of this. So hello world, and now it's capitalized, capital N, capital T. All right, so how are we going to build this property wrapper? Let's come up here, let's create an @property wrapper. it's going to be a struct just like the one in the previous video. I think most property wrappers are structs because of the mutating state that we have to deal with. I talked about that in the last video. So property wrapper, struct, let's call this @capitalized. And this will conform to dynamic property so that the SwiftUI view knows to update when this @state gets updated. And this state in here is going to hold the value. Let's call it value actually of type string. And we need an initializer here. So in our initializer, we want to set the current value. Sorry, this should be a variable. We want to set the current value of this in our initializer. So let's enter in here a starting wrapped value of type string. And we'll set self.value equal to the injected wrapped value dot capitalize. All right. Now we know every property wrapper needs a wrapped value. Click fix here, and I'm just going to cut this and move it down right here. So this wrapped value will be of type string, of course, and it's going to have a getter and a setter. Just like in the last property wrapper here, we had a wrapped value, we had a getter and a non-mutating setter. So let's actually make this a non-mutating set. Now, when we get the current value, we're just going to get the value as is. So I'll paste this in here. And when we set the current value, we want to set the new value equal to the new value that we're getting from the setter capitalized. So when we initialize it, we're making sure we're capitalizing the string. And when we set it, we're making sure we're capitalizing the string. So just like that, there's a little bit of code. And now I can come down to my view here, and I can actually use @capitalized. So notice before we begin, the W in world is not capitalized. But if I use @capitalized, the W will start capitalized by default. And when I set a new title, which is all lowercase here, it is now capitalized by default. So that fast and that easy to actually just create a property wrapper. I know in the last video, it seemed super complicated to get to this, but if I didn't go through all those steps, we wouldn't actually understand what all of this means. I can now very easily customize this. So for example, if I copy and paste it and I do @uppercased, I can call it .uppercased instead, maybe of capitalized. Now let's comp this one out and we can do @uppercased. And let's look at the preview. Now it's fully uppercased and it's fully uppercased. So it's that easy just to make a custom property wrapper. We literally just did it in like 2 minutes. We made 2 already. We're going to walk through a couple more complex examples here, probably more complex than you're ever going to need, but I think it's a really good practice. So what we're now going to do is actually build off of the property wrapper in the last video. So in the last video, we created this @FileManager property, and we saved a string to the file manager. So basically what we're going to do right now is take this FileManager property and expand it so that instead of just saving a string, we can save any type that conforms to Codable. And the reason we're doing this is because sometimes we have these data models that we want to save somewhere. And if you've ever worked with user defaults, you know user defaults does not take Codable. It takes Boolean, strings, integers, and very simple pieces of data. So maybe in our app, and oftentimes in my apps, I want to save a data model to the file manager directly. And instead of having to rewrite that code, I write a nice property wrapper. So let's come here and let's actually just copy this file manager property. And I'm going to jump back to the property wrappers 2 bootcamp. We're going to paste it in here. Because we can't have 2 property wrappers with the same name, let's make this one FileManagerCodable property. So anything that conforms to Codable will be able to be saved with this property wrapper. So again, I'm pulling this from the last video. If you weren't with me, I highly recommend watching that. But I'll just leave this here for 1 second if you want to copy this code. It's also available on my GitHub @SwiftUI. And this property wrapper right now basically takes a string as the wrapped value and saves that string to the file manager. This FileManager.documents path looks like this. It's just a quick extension for File Manager, just a convenience extension. So you can copy this if you need to as well. I'm going to jump back and let's start customizing this new property wrapper. So again, right now, if I just use this as is, it's going to be @FileManagerCodable property, which has a key. Let's call this maybe user profile. Let's make it a private var and we'll call it user profile of type. Right now it's of type string and I'll set it equal to test as the default starting value. So this is what we built in the last video. We have the key that we're saving to and from the file manager, and we are saving user profile. Let's just put that on the screen real quick just to make sure that it is working. So I'm going to put up here text user profile, and we should see test on the screen. Let's actually make it a quick button as well. And I'm going to put the user profile here. And if we set the user profile equal to another value, it should be saving to the file manager. And click test, and another value appears. And just to confirm that again, we're going to just open up the terminal. So I'm just going to do a quick on appear here. I'm just going to print out the NS home directory. I'm going to take this property wrapper to Bootcamp, make it the first file in my app. Let's build and run it to a simulator just to get the printout real quick. And when I get this, I should get this new, where is it? All right, and it looks like nothing is saved to userprofile.txt right now. So let's just click test and it should save. So I'm going to now copy this path here. Let's go to the documents folder. Let's open up the terminal. I'm going to type open and paste in that path, and I should see the user profile saving here. Another value saved. Perfect. All right. So again, our property wrapper right now saves strings, but we wanted to save data models. So for example, maybe I have a user profile in my app, right? So let's create a struct called user. Let's just call it user and open the brackets. Every user will have a name of type string, maybe an age of type int, and maybe a is premium of type bool. And I want to be able to save a user directly to the file manager, not just a string, not just an integer. And we know app storage does not support custom structs. App storage only supports basic types. So what we're going to do is make the user conform to Codable. I think most data models that we would download or save are Codable by default. And we want to update this property wrapper to support Codable instead of string. So let's come up here to the property wrapper, and we have this title here. I'm going to change the word title to just value. And the value, we want it to be any type that conforms to Codable. So in here, I'll make this type T, and we'll define at the struct level that T is going to be anything that conforms to Codable. All right. And while we're at it, I want to make T optional, because if there is nothing to start, I don't want to start with a default user value. I want it to be optional by default. We have this optional type T here, and the wrapped value should probably be optional T as well. When we get the value, we're going to get the current value. So let's just paste this here. And then when we set the value, we are going to save and set the new value as well. All right, so let's go down to our save function, and our save function, instead of having a type string, we should have type T, and it should be optional. Should get this error to go away. And now in our code here, let's delete this comment. And before we were writing a string to the file manager, so we use this convenient method, but we need to actually encode the data model to a JSON format, and then we are going to write the data. So we're not just going to write the object as is. We've done this many times on my channel. If you don't know about Codable, I have a whole video on it in the continued learning playlist. Highly recommend, one of the best videos on the channel. Let data equals try, and let's call the JSON encoder. So we're going to create a JSON encoder to encode the new value to data. So we'll call .encode on it, and we'll pass in the new value. Then now that we have the data, we need to write it. So now we're going to call try data.write to, and we're going to write to the same path that we were writing to before. Let's delete this here, and then we're going to set the value equal to the new value. All right, I'll delete this. I'm going to delete this. So if it saves, we should get success save printing out to the console. And the last thing we need to do now is, instead of reading a string from the file manager, we need to actually decode the data and then convert it back into type T. So in our initializer here, let's update this. Let's first say let URL equals the URL where we're going to read from. Let's say let data equals try, and we're going to try to get the data with the contents of the URL that we are trying to read from. If we get the data, let's now decode it back into our data type. So we'll say let object equals try. Let's open up a JSON decoder, and we will decode. We need to decode up to type t.self. And of course, we're decoding data. And if we do get this object, we're going to set the value equal to the object. Now we'll delete this line of code here. All right. So if we get a saved value, we're going to use that. And if we don't have a saved value, we're going to use the initial wrapped value that we're injecting. So we're actually, instead of starting with a default value of string, we're going to start with a default value of optional t. And then we would set the value equal to the wrapped value here. All right, let's comment out the projected value because we're not using it just yet. Let's come down to our code. Let's change out our string here for type user, make it optional, and we'll give it a default initial value of nil. All right, so now let's put on the screen the user profile, let's say maybe .name. And when we click user profile, I'm just going to save a new user. Let's give it the name Nick. Let's give it the age 100. So you guys don't know how old I am and is premium. Put it to true because I'm obviously a premium user. All right. If there's no value, we're just going to put it here a default of no value. Let's build and run this to a simulator, see what prints out to our console. So at the start, it could not decode a value from the file manager, so there is no value. If I click this, it should now save. We can see Nick is appearing, and we got success saved printed out to the console. If I go back to the Finder where we are saving these, and I open up the user profile.txt, I can now see that the entire data model has saved as a text file to the file manager. So now I have a super convenient way to basically save any type that conforms to Codable to the file manager. So this could be incredibly handy. So if I have any sort of data model that doesn't normally save to app storage, I could just use my FileManagerCodable property. Let's keep in mind that the file manager is not for sensitive data. So if you have sensitive data like passwords or credit card information, that should probably be saved in the keychain. And it might be a good idea for you to make a keychain codable property or something along those lines. But for now, I think this is a great start. Before we end this video though, we're going to optimize this and make it so much better and so much cooler than it currently is. I'm going to build it and run it one more time. And I'm noticing that the console is printing out success read, but it still says no value on my screen. So there's a little bit of a bug here. It took me a second to realize what's going on. Basically, I think it's because we made this value optional. We are trying to initialize the property wrapper of @state here. We are actually trying to initialize here the @state property wrapper of this value because we didn't give this a default value here. So really what we need to do is initialize the property wrapper. So the underscore value, underscore referencing the property wrapper of this. And we'll set it equal to a state with an initial wrapped value of the object. And if there's nothing saved, we'll use the underscore value here with a state of wrapped value, and we're going to pass in the wrapped value. Awesome. Let's build and run this real quick, make sure it works. Hopefully it actually reads this time, and we got Nick on the screen, so it looks like we're cruising. Before we move on, let's optimize this a little bit. So personally, I actually don't want the ability to set a default value here. So sometimes I do, and for Booleans and integers, this is great. We can give it a default value. But for something like a codable model, I would never want to actually save a default empty user, something like this. You can imagine a situation where another developer in your code base writes this line of code, and then it's actually going to save this blank user to the file manager. So if I had code in my app, like if let name equals user profile.name, this actually might turn into a bug in my app because user profile.name is a blank string with this default blank initializer. So in certain cases like this one, I actually don't even want the ability to give it a default wrapped value. I just want the ability to either we have saved a user profile and it's there, or it should be nil. So what I'm going to do is actually delete the ability to set a wrapped value. We're going to come up here and let's delete the wrapped value. And we're going to say if there is a value saved, use that. If not, we'll start with nil. So this way we don't expose that wrapped value to the actual view anymore. Just a personal preference for this property wrapper. All right, and then I will delete this. And let's keep moving here. All right, add some space. All right, let's create a child view of property wrapper 2 bootcamp. So down here, let's create a struct. Let's call this some binding view. Why not? Make it a view. Every view has a body, and we'll open the brackets here. And what we're going to do is just try to update the user profile from this screen. So here I'm going to pass in an at binding. Let's call it var user profile of type. And we're going to pass in here some binding view. And we're going to pass in the money sign user profile. If you followed the last video and you followed this one, you probably already know why this is not compiling. And that's because we don't have a projected value in the property wrapper. So we don't have anything for the $sign. Let's come up to our code here and uncomment out the projected value. The projected value should be a binding of type optional T. And the getter, we're just going to get the wrapped value, and then we're going to set the new wrapped value. All right, and let's actually just rewrite this so that it looks a little cooler, because I see a lot of people doing this other shorthand method. Do a getter and a setter. And in our getter, let's just get the wrapped value. And in our setter, let's just set the wrapped value equal to the $0, referencing that new value. So this code and this code are exactly the same. I think maybe this is a little bit more common to see. I think it's a little more confusing, but we're learning here and I wanted to show it to you guys. Now we have a projected value, and hopefully if we click our button here, let's try to save a new user. Let's name this Jessica, age, I don't know, is premium false. Let's build and run this to the simulator. My simulator opens, it says Nick. I click it, it says Jessica. If I open up the terminal again, and I'm just going to open up this folder, and I open up the user profile, we can see Jessica is saved with her age, and her is premium is false. So now we have a binding property wrapper. We can save anything, any codable type to the file manager with literally one line of code. All right, now we're gonna get into some crazy stuff that you probably might never need to use in your code, but I actually have started using it and absolutely love it. So I'm excited to introduce you guys to this next layer. We're gonna take what we have, as if this is not cool enough, and just inject steroids onto it and make it incredibly cool. We're going to write some of the coolest code now that I think I've seen in SwiftUI, and I want you guys to comment below afterward what you think. So let's rewind for a second. 2 videos ago, I introduced you guys to Keypaths, right? And we talked about how we did some sorting with Keypaths. Where is it here? So we created an extension for sort by Keypath. I thought that was really cool. But at the beginning of that video, I showed you guys just real quickly, we have variables like the environment dismiss in SwiftUI, where we use that \dismiss. And when we create other property wrappers like app storage, we inject a key and we don't actually just use a \dismiss. Now for most things in our app, we probably do want to just make custom keys. But custom keys can be a little finicky, right? Because if you accidentally change the key, now you've changed where it's being saved. And if you have a large application, and maybe you're pulling this same value on multiple screens, you're going to have to rewrite this string every single time. So sometimes, such as using the environment here, we want to make sure that we are referencing the same exact key path. So what we're going to do now is take our FileManagerCodable and be able to initialize it. Instead of doing this, we're going to do this. So let's jump back into Property Wrapper 2 Bootcamp. And before we begin, I do want to point out that yes, we can create some sort of custom like enum and call it FileManagerKeys. And then inside the enum, we have maybe case user profile, and these keys have a raw value of string, right? So we could then just call something like FileManagerKeys.userProfile.raw value. Yes, this absolutely works and will make sure that we don't have typos, but I think using the KeyPaths is cooler, it's more convenient, and that's why we're going to do it. So there's nothing wrong with writing out your strings. There's nothing wrong with using enums or something like this, but KeyPaths are pretty freaking cool. So let's come up here and let's actually create some KeyPaths. So I'm going to create, let's make it a struct and just call it FileManager values. We'll call it FileManager values. And we're going to make this a singleton because we're not going to pass this around our app. We're just going to have one instance of FileManager values like this. And we'll make it a private init and open and close the bracket. All right. In here, I'm going to create the KeyPath for user profile. And we're just going to set it equal to user profile to start. All right. And now let's come up into our actual property wrapper. So I don't want to actually delete the initializer by string because in case I don't have a KeyPath, I want the ability to also keep the string initializer. So we're just going to copy this and create a second init here. And this one, we will initialize it from a KeyPath. So I'm just going to jump back to the Keypath bootcamp. KeyPath is a generic type that has an element and a value. And so when we did this sorted by date, the element was actually the array type that we were in, and the T was the comparable type, the actual date that we were sorting on. And so when we jump back here, we're going to create a KeyPath, and we need the element type. So the type is going to be the FileManager values. And we need an actual value type, which is going to be a string. So now we're going to pass in a KeyPath, and then we want to access the actual value from it. So let's access our singleton. We'll say let KeyPath equals, let's access the FileManager values dot shared, the shared instance, and we're going to open up the square brackets to access the KeyPath. You'll notice that the KeyPath here is the exact same as this. So we'll pass in this as the key. So from this KeyPath now, we need to actually get the key. And if I hold the option button now, we can see that the KeyPath is of type string. That's the type that we said it was going to be. So here, let's say let key equals the KeyPath. We're going to change this in 1 second. So now I should be able to actually use this. So let's come down to the code here. And I'm going to copy and comment out the user profile. And let's use the other initializer with the / user profile. Let's build and run this to the simulator real quick. And it looks like Jessica is loaded, so our KeyPath is clearly working. Just like that, we've written even better code here. And let's test it real quick. I'm going to change this to Mike. Let's build and run it. And hopefully Mike saves as well. Awesome. Build and run it. And just like that, we have KeyPaths saving to our Codable property. I'm going to take this one final step further just to kind of show off a little bit. When I go back to the KeyPaths bootcamp and I look at the environment dismiss here, right, we can see that there is no type. We didn't have to say this was of type string or Boolean or whatever the dismiss is, right? Isn't it really convenient how we just type at var dismiss and we don't have to type in all this extra. There's no wrapped value. There's not even a type. It just knows what dismiss is going to be. And if I go back to our property wrapper 2 bootcamp, we still have to type in user. So you could imagine a situation in our app where we save to the user profile key, but somebody changes this on accident to some other type, right? It's still going to work, but now the user profile is not actually a user in our app. It's a string. So I'm going to actually couple this purposely, the user profile key to the user type. Again, we're just showing off here because why not? So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to create a custom type. Let's call this struct, call this FileManagerKeyPath. KeyPath, and open the brackets. All right. So every KeyPath is going to need to have a key, so the string that we originally had, but it also needs to be coupled to the T, the type that we are going to be decoding and encoding. So FileManagerKeyPath, let's say let key of type string, and then let's also add in the type, and let's make it of type T.type. Now what is T? T is going to be defined as anything that conforms to Codable. So .type here refers to the type of T and not actually an instance of T. All right, so now the user profile, I'm going to make it a FileManager Keypath, where the key is user profile and the type is a user.self. So the type of user. I'm going to come up to my property wrapper. And now we know the key path here is no longer type string, but rather type FileManager Keypath. So I'm going to make this FileManager Keypath here. FileManager Keypath takes type T as well. So let's pass in here type T. And now the keypath is going to be the keypath dot not the type, but the key inside. And that T is going to be inferred from the key path. So now if I go down to my code, I can actually, when I write this, I can actually just write it like this. Build and run this to see if it works. Mike is saved, then it loaded. Let's change this to Emily. Build and run it real quick. Mike, and now it says Emily, and did it save? Let's see. Emily, bang. So now we have this user profile, which we can see is of type user, but I don't actually have to define it as type user here. So this is, I think, just really, really sleek looking code. Awesome, guys. All right, and if that was not enough, we're going to do one more property wrapper here before we finish up, just to take our Codable property to the next level. Right? There's always another level, and I am happy to show it to you guys. So what are we looking at here? So in our code, right, we have this user profile, but sometimes when we're building SwiftUI, we want to build really reactive code where we are listening to like the change of some value. So we could do like an on change of, and we can listen to the change of user profile or the name in user profile and then perform an action. You could imagine a situation where we have this user profile not in the view, but in some other layer of our code. And we want to listen to it as if we were using like the Combine framework, or even if we were using Async-await, we want to listen for updates. So anytime this changes, we want to perform some action. So I'm not going to go into Combine and Async-await, but that's what we're going to use in the rest of this video. So if you don't know what that is, you probably just haven't watched enough videos on my channel because we've been using Combine and Async-await a ton. The first thing I want to do is add in a publisher into this property wrapper so that I could subscribe to it if I need to. So for example, we can call that onReceive and we can listen to the values publishing from the property wrapper itself. This is the same as if we were adding a subscriber. So for example, in some view models, we would create like a $sign and listen to the publisher value, and then we would sync, right? But we can't actually do this unless we have a publisher. So what we're going to do is come up here. And again, I'm just going to copy this property wrapper because I don't want to mess it up in case you want to use it as is. Let's come down here and paste in yet another FileManagerCodable. Let's call this one FileManagerCodable Streamable property. Okay. So in the Combine framework, there's something called a current value subject. Let's first import Combine. And then inside our property wrapper, let's create a private let. We'll call this publisher of type current value subject. If you don't know what this is, go watch my Combine videos because this is just a simple publisher that holds a current value. And this publisher is generic, where we have to tell it what type it is going to publish. Of course, that's optional T, and it's never going to throw an error. And so now let's initialize our publisher when we initialize our property wrapper. So down in our struct here, if we get the value, we're going to initialize the publisher as a current value subject with the object as the current value. And if there is no saved value, we'll set the publisher equal to the current value subject with nil to start. All right, so now we have this publisher. Let's copy this and just paste it inside our other initializer here as well, just so we support Keypath as well. All right, and now anytime I update the state, I want to make sure I publish that value to the publisher as well. So I'm going to come down here, and when we save a new value, I'm going to also send a new value to the publisher. So I'll call publisher.send, and let's pass in the new value. The save should actually be private. Now, instead of exposing a binding, let's expose the publisher itself. So in this streamable property, I'm going to actually comment out this projected value. And we're going to paste in another one where the projected value is actually of type current value subject. So it's a publisher, and we will just return the publisher as the projected value. Let's come down to our code and use this. So I'm going to come down here and let's copy and paste. And then we're going to use FileManagerCodable Streamable property. And you'll notice when I run this now, we cannot convert this because before we were trying to use the binding with that wrapped value, but that wrapped value now is actually a combined publisher. So I'm going to comment this out. We're going to call .onReceive, and we're going to access the user profile with the $sign here, and this will be our new value. So in here, let's just print out received new value of, and paste the new value. I'm going to take my button and copy it and just put a button back up in our parent view here. Let's change the name to Nick 1111 true, and let's build and run this. So now, instead of having a binding, we have a publisher as the wrapped value. So when I run this, we can see that Emily loaded, and we've received a new value of Emily here. And so when I click the button, so not only is the property wrapper updating itself, but we should also receive a value through our publisher. So I'll click this and saved and received a new value of Nick. So now I can use this like any other combined publisher or subscriber in my app. So if you have this property wrapper that's not in the view, if it's in some other place in your code, you can subscribe to the current value, right? If you don't know what I'm talking about with publishers and subscribers, you just probably have not watched much on my channel, but I think this is like really powerful stuff. All right. And one really cool thing about these publishers is that they automatically convert to Swift concurrency. So coming down here, I have my onReceive, right? I'm going to comment this out, but in Async-await, we use tasks and we await for values. So we could do for await new value in, and let's access the user profile with the $sign here. So we're going to access the current value subject dot value. Now, I have a video on my channel about async publishers. It's in the Swift concurrency playlist. And it's basically converting any publisher into an async publisher so that we can listen and stream the values. So in here, I can now print received a new value. So I'm going to call this stream new value of new value. So again, let's test this out. Let's change the name to maybe Ricky. Let's press run. Shout out Ricky if you're watching this. Ricky is one of the admins in our Discord. And if you're not in our Discord, you might as well join. It's a lot of fun, a great community. I'm going to click Nick, and now we have streamed a new value of Ricky. So now we can use our property wrapper with Async-await. And I think that's really, really cool. So just opening up the flexibility of, we can use these in our views, we can use these in our manager classes, we can use these basically anywhere. We can use them with Combine, we can use them with Swift concurrency, or just basic bindings. Now to wrap up this video, I just want to do one final finesse here. I want the ability to basically use this binding, but I also want the ability to use Combine, and I also want the ability to use Async-await, because I understand how to use this, but it's not super easy for a junior developer on my team, and I don't want to make the trade-off between a publisher and a binding. So we're going to come up here, and we're going to create another struct, and I'm going to call this one a custom projected value, and open up the brackets. So up here, we had a projected value of type binding of type T, as well as a projected value of current value subject of type T with an error of never. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to come down to my code here. So this custom projected value is going to have a binding. So let's call this binding of type T. And let's also call this a publisher of type current value subject optional T never.
delete this. And of course, T is anything that conforms to Codable. I also want to just easily expose the stream. So here we call the user profile.values, but let's also just expose the stream directly. I'll call this stream, and let's make it maybe a type string for 1 second. And let's set this equal to the publisher dot value. I don't really know what type this is, so I'm just going to say let this equals that. I'm going to hold the option button and click on this. And I can see that it's of type async publisher with a current value subject. I'm going to make that the type here. Great. Let's finish up this video using our custom projected value. Come up to my property wrapper here. I'm going to create another var projected value of type this with type T, of course. And let's create a custom projected value. It's going to have a binding as well as a publisher. Now we already have a binding down here, so I'm just going to uncomment this. I'm going to cut it, paste it here, and we already have a publisher, so I'm just going to pass in our publisher itself. Delete this. Now let's use the custom projected value. So coming down to my code here, I have, instead of listening to the publisher.values, we're going to listen to the user profile.stream. We can also listen to the user profile.publisher. And we can also now bind to the user profile.bind. I'm going to change the user in here down back to Nick. I'm going to click run. We're going to run this one final time. And let's see what happens. It says Ricky. And let's see, the binding is the middle one. So I'm going to click on the binding. And we should get success saved, received a value, and streamed a value. And of course it worked because our binding updated on the screen. Cool. All right, that was a lot of code, but I hope you guys stuck with me. I really hope you guys understand now why in the previous video we took the time to dive deep into this, because now we can just play around with all these different implementations. I don't think you need to make everything conform to Codable and have custom projected values, right? A simple property wrapper like uppercased or capitalized is very powerful and only takes 2 seconds to write this code. But if you get more advanced and you start doing things like we just did with these Keypaths and these streamable properties, you can really get into some really intricate stuff. I think this right now is probably one of the most powerful lines of code in my entire application. This is awesome. Please let me know in the comments below if you agree or not. It is Friday night at 10 p.m. and I'm getting tired. You can probably hear it in my voice. I'm going to go grab a coffee, probably record a couple more videos, but that is it for property wrappers, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, my name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking. Please hit that subscribe button if you are not subscribed. These videos are free and they take a ton of time and effort to create. Thank you guys for watching. As always, my name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I will see you in the next video.